Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the second of a double bill. If you didn't catch the earlier show with Seth talking about the first day, we ended up having to break the show into two parts of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. You've got to go and watch it. Seth is absolutely fantastic. And talking about absolutely fantastic guests, well, it brings us to what we're talking about today. And we are on the Eastern Front again, specifically 80 years ago, to look at the destruction of the German Ninth Army as the Red Army pushed its way west. Everyone's favorite Eastern Front guest, Prit, is back, whose new Bagration book is coming soon. We'll find out hopefully exactly when during the show, but I'll bring him in now. Good evening, Prit. How are you today?
Well, good evening, Woody, and good evening, everyone. I couldn't possibly let you do an Eastern Front week without being involved, so thank you very much for having me.
It would just somehow seem not right. It would just feel weird. So you're here. And we were just talking before going live, and we did the same thing with Seth when we talked about the Pacific War. It's always a good point to just remind ourselves how big this front is, and we're just coming off the back of Normandy content, and there'll be Normandy content again next week and later in the summer. And even we were just talking at the broadest of the Eisenhower broad front, it comes to what, about a quarter or a third of the Eastern Front frontage at this point?
I can't remember which Führer directive it was towards the end of 1943 when Hitler said the objective from here on is to keep as much resource as we can in the West ready to smash the Western Allies when they land, and we will fight on the East with a minimum amount of troops to keep the Soviets at arm's length. The minimum amount ultimately coming to in excess of 70% of the Wehrmacht. So even when they're giving priority to the West, still getting on for 3/4 of their armed forces are still committed just to holding the Red Army at bay and ultimately not doing a very good job of it.
Not holding the army at bay anywhere, all fronts. They're losing. And yet we came up with Steve Zaloga yesterday. They are still able to slow things down. The Germans at times they have become very good at just slowing down what the advance is coming towards them and just attriting the Allies as much as the Allies are attriting them, and just being stubborn and difficult and using terrain very well. And I think we often, again, with the specific this afternoon, we leap from sometimes major campaigns to major campaigns and forget that all through in between them, they were still just fighting. They were still doing their best. And yes, ultimately they're not succeeding, the Germans, but they are just being increasingly annoying and beyond that.
Well, it's a very good point. And one of the reasons that Bagration has long interested me is this whole business of, until you get to this battle, actually the Red Army has found it very, very difficult to break through the German defensive lines. The bloodletting around the Rzhev salient, the failed attempts to break through it, Leningrad, etc. And there are so many factors involved here, the gradual decline of the Wehrmacht, the gradual improvements in the Red Army, but also there are other trends that are worth looking at. So if you look at the numerical combat strength of a 1941 infantry division of the Wehrmacht compared to 1944, you actually have fewer men in the trenches in 1944 than in 1941, and that's if you have a full strength infantry division. However, the overall firepower of the 44 division is higher because you have a lot more automatic weapons. And this is meant to compensate in some way for the fact that you actually have fewer troops. The problem with it is that if you lose, let's say, a couple of hundred casualties in a 1941 division compared to a couple of hundred casualties in a 1944 division, it has a much bigger impact on your overall firepower. So the 1944 divisions can fight very hard. They can really make a mess of an attack. But if you can wear them down enough and they break, they will then go downhill very, very rapidly. And also, something I've touched on in previous shows, the relative immobility of German infantry with so much reliance upon horse-drawn artillery, etc. You drive them out of their positions, they start to cut and run, and they're going to fall apart very quickly. Someone asked, they didn't have the Sturmgewehr, Andreas, in the summer of 44. I think it starts to appear towards the end of 44, but certainly in Bagration, everyone's just armed with rifles and, well, of course they have their machine guns, etc. And they have the the lethally effective MG42. But like I say, you start killing these people off, and the division's firepower goes down very quickly.
Brilliant. Well, we've brought the slides up, so you know what to do, folks. Fire away with questions. Although Prit, of course, watches the comments himself. He's so slick and professional now. He does my job for me. I can actually go off and do something.
You've trained me so well. You've trained me so well. Okay, let's go. Next slide then. So this is a brief overview of the whole position of Army Group Center. And, you could spend a week's worth of shows on this enormous operation and how it unfolded. And that front line is going to move from where it is at the right-hand side of the map to and beyond the left-hand side. Madcap 352 will touch on Soviet deception in a moment. We're going to be concentrating towards the bottom of this map. Bobruisk is towards the bottom right. This is part of 9th Army's area. And this was, if you like, one of the last bits of this massive operation to kick off. The Red Army had inherited from the Imperial Russian Army of a tactic they developed in 1916, which was, if you had a massive operation like this, different parts of the Russian or Soviet forces would go into action at different times. Part of this was just the logistic reality and the command reality. It was easier to let one bit do its thing and then move on to the next bit. But there was also a massive advantage in that if you attack in one place, the Germans will rush their reserves over there, and then you can attack in another place. And it's quite possible that the other side will then turn around and start, we'll send those reserves back again, and they don't actually end up intervening in either sector. So we're going to be concentrating at the bottom end of this map. There was a plan at one point that Army Group Center would pull back towards the Berezina River, which you can see just to the right of center. This would have shortened the front line considerably, releasing substantial reserves, which would have made a Soviet breakthrough almost impossible, but inevitably the Führer was not prepared to give up an inch of ground unless his troops were being physically kicked off it. So very briefly, to deal with the question of Soviet deception and Maskirovka, the Soviets played they made an enormous fuss about how effective that was prior to Bagration. They persuaded the Germans that the real punch was going to land to the south of this map. Right at the bottom of this map, we have the region of the Pripyat marshes, which is pretty difficult to operate in. So operations are either north of the Pripyat, as it's going to take place here, or to the south of the Pripyat, in which case you're really into North Ukraine. They managed to persuade the Germans that their main effort would fall on Army Group North Ukraine. And the Soviet historiography credits Maskirovka, the deception plan, as being responsible for this. But the problem was that the Germans already reckoned it was going to fall on Army Group North Ukraine, so they interpreted what they saw entirely in the sense of, positive confirmation bias. They paid a lot of attention to stuff that confirmed what they knew and ignored the stuff that they didn't.
And they're doing the same in the West.
Well, indeed. Well, nothing really changes, does it? And the German military intelligence was really shockingly amateur compared to that of the opposing sides. By now, Fremde Heere Ost under Reinhard Gehlen was pretty much just doing crystal ball gazing. Their intelligence resources were so minimal. And Gehlen had become the king of writing reports that could mean pretty much anything you wanted them to mean. So he would write something like, we think the main effort is going to fall on Army Group North Ukraine. But it's worth pointing out that other sectors of the front have sufficient resources to launch substantial operations of their own. But that may or may not happen. And like I say, his ability to word this in ways that was so utterly useless in terms of of actually, if you're reading his reports in order to get a feel for what's the enemy going to do, they're useless. If you want to read them in order to get confirmation of your own suspicions, you could, much like exactly like a horoscope, you could find something in his report that said, yeah, it's definitely going to be here. So the other point about the deception plan is just to linger on this a little bit, just to make the point that one of the successes of Maskarovka and the deception plan in Soviet historiography was persuading the world's historians that the Soviets were very good at deception. So that becomes, if you like, a layer of deception all of its own, so that in any future conflict, the enemies might think, well, these guys are damn cunning, and they'll lead us into all sorts of blind alleys. By making such a big fuss about Maskarovka and about how good they were at deception, their intention was to sow doubt in the future operations on intelligence that an enemy might be getting.
That's really good, Prit, because that reminds us of what Giles was saying 2 days ago about the fact that Stalin has already realized there's a new chapter dawning at the end of World War II. So, he's doing the card trick. He's moving his cards around in his pack now to kind of, so he'd open things up to a certain amount to get the things he wanted from the West to wage war on it. But now he's starting to kind of close the curtains and hide things up a bit and deceit and stuff. That's a really, really interesting point you made there. I ought to just say, we're going to bring this up, but Sam asked about not to go straight into the heavy stuff, but are the Red Army much better at picking places where they can actually concentrate since some of the debacles earlier?
Well, I think they probably are, but they're also benefiting from, as they move west across the Soviet Union, they move into a region where there are actually just better railroads. So because we're now fighting further west, actually it's pretty good. You're in an area where naturally the railroads are along the main axes that you want to be pushing on. So, here we have the main axis that runs here from Orsha on the right-hand side through Minsk, on through Baranovichi. It's going to carry on all the way to Warsaw on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side through Smolensk up to Moscow. This is the main, corridor. So all the good roads are here. And although I don't show any terrain apart from rivers here, the main thing here is that this is a very forested region and a very swampy region, like much of the Soviet Union. And where the railways run tends to be where the better roads are. You have these strips of slightly higher ground that's drained better, that's firmer, and that's where the towns are. And just purely for long-standing historical reasons, this is an area where these axes of communication all run in favorable directions for the Soviets. So it's not so much they have chosen an area where things are better for them logistically. It's just the reality of fighting in this part of the Soviet Union. So shall we move on? So next slide. This is Field Marshal Ernst Busch, who is the commander of Army Group Center. Not one of the most gifted field marshals in the pantheon of the Wehrmacht. He commanded an army at the start of Barbarossa. He led it competently enough and was then appointed as commander of Army Group Center when Kluge was injured. He was a very, very loyal supporter of Hitler. Even before the Nazis, he was one of these people who enthusiastically embraced this concept of social Darwinism, that just like animals will compete and the strongest will survive and the weakest will go down, Busch believed, like all social Darwinists, similarly, conflicts between nations will be decided with the strongest prevailing over the weakest, and he fully intended Germany to be part of the strongest. And he took this to its logical extreme in his writings. He talked about fairly, what we would regard as unacceptably ruthless outcomes in wars, because that was how he saw the world. So he's okay. He's quietly competent. He's not brilliant. He is not a visionary commander. Very much more suited, if you like, to defensive fighting than offensive operations. You wouldn't trust him with a handful of panzer divisions, for example. But his biggest bonus from the point of Adolf Hitler is that he is unbendingly loyal, and he will do precisely what he's told. And we're going to see that in spades as this unfolds. So next slide. And here are some of the main characters here. For our particular battle. On the right is General Hans Jordan, who is commander, or Jordan, who's commander of 9th Army. On the left with the binoculars is Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, real mouthful. He is from Polish-Russian stock, if you like. Remember, much of Poland was part of the Russian Empire when Rokossovsky was a young man. He served during the First World War and the Russian Civil War. He was arrested during Stalin's purges because he had been denounced by somebody else who was being tortured, and gave up his name in an attempt to avoid torture. He refused to denounce anybody else. He was very badly treated. His teeth were knocked out by his interrogators. He was released in 1941 and entered service, or returned to service, and immediately fought with considerable distinction on the central axis of the Eastern Front. Yes, absolutely. He had steel teeth, Mehdi. He had stainless steel dentures made, and he made a point of smiling with these, just to remind everybody of what he had gone through. Now, during the planning of this operation, we're going to be dealing with the key city in Hans Jordan's sector of the German line is Bobruisk, and Rokossovsky writes in his memoirs how Stalin at the original planning conference talked about a single thrust to capture the city. And Rokossovsky says he argued for a pincer attack instead, on the grounds it would potentially have the advantage of having fewer casualties. He describes how Stalin said, no, I think we should go for a single thrust. And he stuck to his guns and said, no, I think it should be a pincer. So Stalin left the room while he thought about it. Molotov and Malenkov bent his ear, saying, you just got to go along with what the boss says. But Rokossovsky stuck to his guns. And when Stalin returned, he persuaded him that it would be a pincer attack. And Stalin smiled and said, all right, fine, it'll be a pincer attack. If you want, on your head be it. Probably quite literally, on your head be it. The problem with this account is that there were only two people present, Rokossovsky and Zhukov, who wrote their memoirs after the event. Zhukov wrote his memoirs after Rokossovsky and went out of his way to say, this didn't happen, and this is a lie. We don't know whether Rokossovsky made this up or not. It's a great story. You can decide for yourselves. Pay your money, take your choice. It wouldn't be the first time, or indeed the last time, that he challenged the orders he was getting, and Stalin used to joke to him about, remember, the charges brought against you haven't actually been dismissed. You haven't been pardoned. And he would chortle at his own humor. And then Rokossovsky would smile back at him with his stainless steel teeth, as if to say, yeah, I know exactly where I stand. After the war, Rokossovsky was sent back to Soviet-occupied Poland to become, I think he did become president at one point. He was certainly Minister of Defense of Poland. He wanted to deploy troops to put down food riots in 1955, I think, but was refused permission by the Soviets to do so. And at the end of his life, he complained bitterly that throughout my life, the Russians have always treated me like a Pole, and the Poles have always treated me like a Russian, which is an interesting observation. So let's move on. Next slide. So we talked about, or I mentioned Hans Jordan, the commander of 9th Army, and on the eve of the Bagration, he wrote this report, which became part of his army's war diary. We'll just concentrate on the highlighted bits. He could see that, contrary to what German intelligence was saying, a very substantial force was building up opposite him, and he was not at all convinced that the alleged build-up against Army Group North Ukraine was anywhere near as much as he was facing. He still believed it was possible to fight a mobile action in order to defeat this, but he says, under the present directives requiring an absolutely rigid defense, I can't do this. And in particular, he thought the establishment of fortresses was a ludicrously dangerous and bad policy to follow. Yes, the Germans did spend a lot of time preparing fieldworks, Rob. Heavy entrenchments, lots of minefields, etc. There was some stuff about minefields higher up. We'll come to that if we have time, because I don't want to get too bogged down in detail. So he had repeatedly suggested we really need to be prepared to fight a maneuver battle. We need to be able to, or at the very least, we need to pull back so I can release reserves. Busch, knowing that Hitler would not like such suggestions, refused even to submit these for consideration. And as a result, Jordan was left helpless, thinking, my troops are going to fight and die in their trenches. They'll do a good job, and then they'll be overwhelmed. It's worth pointing at I think someone asked about the quality of troops in 9th Army at this stage. Like most of Army Group Centre, most of these divisions are actually in pretty good shape. Numerically, they're reasonably strong. They are made up of a mixture of veterans and fresh recruits, but there's a good blend of the two. Their main weakness, though, is tanks. They have very little by way of armor. On the eve of the battle, 20th Panzer Division is moved to Army Group Centre with about 100 Panzer IVs. This more than doubles the tank strength of Army Group Centre. And you compare that to the thousands of tanks sitting on the other side of the front line. Also remember, this is an era when Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks have not yet started making their appearance in large numbers. I think the Panzer Schreck turns up in probably another couple of months. So at this point, the troops are still defending you against armor with their very limited anti-tank resources in their divisions. And the German divisions infantry divisions are always very light on this. Few Sturmgeschütz brigades, etc. But really, it's no substitute for having proper panzer divisions operating behind the line. Right, next slide, please. So, 22nd of June, Bagration commences in the north. Vitebsk comes under massive pressure almost immediately, and 3rd Panzer Army, the northernmost part of Army Group Centre, almost collapses on the first day. At first, Busch and Reinhardt, commander of 3rd Panzer Army, are remarkably bullish in the face of all the evidence, saying, well, we can deal with this, it's not going to be too bad. Yet, just a day and a half after the operation has started, Busch is already on the phone to Berlin saying that I need reinforcements or 3rd Panzer Army is going to fall over in a heap. And he wants to abandon Vitebsk, but there is no permission from Hitler for that to happen. He promises reinforcements from Army Group North, but that's going to take time. They've got to be pulled out of line. Other units in Army Group North have to take over their positions, and then they have to be shipped down by railway. It's all going to take time, and the Red Army has no intention of giving them any time at all. So next slide. So here we are at the southern end of that bulge that we were looking at earlier. And this is when Rokossovsky's 2 assaults towards Bobruisk began, one from the east and one from the south. As you can see, even on the first day, the southern attack really made substantial progress. The northern one, more modest progress. They had a river line to cross. They had to break through some very tough defenses. The reason the southern attack seems to have done particularly well on this map is because, slightly counterintuitively, it was through territory that was difficult to move through. As a result, the Germans hadn't fortified it as heavily, and they hadn't garrisoned it as heavily. So although the Soviet units described considerable difficulty moving through these swampy forests, trying to build, corduroy roads through the swamps, etc., losing tanks that slipped off these roads. Nevertheless, once they were through that initial swamp, they were away. And you can see here on the first day, they've already pushed a good 20 miles into the German lines, and already the situation is turning pretty bad very, very quickly. So next slide, please. So 24th of June, 20th Panzer Division, which is, like I say, more than half of Army Group Center's tanks, is ordered to counterattack against that northern pincer moving towards Bobruisk. No sooner has the division started moving off than Busch turns around and says, no, we're going to need you further down to the south. So at the very best, you can use one battle group for the counterattack in the north, and the rest are going to head south, which is awkward because the division command, this is the old Guderian policy of Klotzen, nicht klechen. You want to strike hard and then move. You don't want your troops to be dispersed like this. Like I said, the southern attack developed slowly at first because of terrain difficulties, but then was rapidly gathering pace. Zeitzler, who was Chief of General Staff at OKH, spoke to Busch and Jordan on the evening of 24th of June, trying to sort out what 20th Panzer Division was doing. And he informed them that the Armoured Battle Group, which was meant to be attacking in the north, is now to disengage and move south. This is going to leave a single company of tanks in the north. Every other part of the division is now to head south. Jordan's really, to say he's unhappy is an understatement. He's deeply pissed off because 20th Panzer Division was meant to be dealing with the northern attack first before heading south. It's now not, then it was told, okay, you can attack in the north, but you're going to have to move other things south. And now it's suddenly told, no, you're going to have to send the whole division south. And it's already started deploying for an attack in the north. And this also then means that that northern attack is basically not going to come under counterattack. And remember, this is the great German doctrine. You counterattack all the time. You try to restore the front line, and yet they're now not doing anything of the sort.
Quick question for you, Prit. Under Rokossovsky, at the corps level and divisional level, do they have, the commanders have much kind of autonomy to take advantage of things, or is it very much a kind of an out-of-the-box plan that they have to kind of follow?
Well, they would all have, Rokossovsky would have submitted plans for his front, which were signed off by Stavka. He would then pass on instructions to his army commanders, saying your role in this, for example, is the northern pincer, and then the army commander in the northern pincer would draw up plans for his various corps level assets to carry out that attack. He would put those up to Rokossovsky, who would or wouldn't approve them, depending on what he felt about this. But the army commanders would have input into the shape of the operation. Now, exactly, how much Rokossovsky would have been influenced if they'd said, well, look, you want me to attack here, but I'd rather attack over here because it's rather better. I think that would depend on who your front commander was. I think Rokossovsky would probably have been quite flexible about that. I think others would not necessarily have been. Zhukov certainly wouldn't have been very receptive to a junior telling him how he thought the operation should be launched. So I guess the shorter answer would have been, it depends.
Okay.
It's a very
good historian's answer there. The answer is complicated. Yeah.
There you go. So next slide, please. So here we are on the 25th now. So again, you can see how the main advances from the southern thrust and the northern thrust towards Bobruisk doesn't seem to have made much headway, but look what they've done. They've actually widened the advance and they've forced a lot more of that river, which means you have more crossing points, you can start moving more logistics forward, etc. And this attack from the north only had one tank corps supporting it. Most of it was rifle corps, and they had to having smashed the German defensive lines, they were laboring forward with their artillery. They had to get those guns across that river, etc., etc. Whereas the southern thrust didn't have that problem. And now, of course, once they've moved forward out of that swampy forested region, the sappers can go to work constructing better roads through that area unmolested, while the Germans have their hands full dealing with this accelerating drive towards Bobruisk from the south. So next slide. So here is a summary. Now let's look at cavalry mechanized groups. This is a really interesting thing. So as you'll all be aware, the Red Army fielded large numbers of cavalry divisions, and throughout the war struggled to make sense of how it was meant to be using these. Like I said, I think way back when I first started doing shows with Woody, when we talked about Soviet airborne operations, cavalry and airborne forces share many characteristics. One is that you can get them into places quickly where other units might take a lot longer, deploying. The other thing they have in common is they're both lightly armed, and they're going to struggle to overcome strong resistance or to put up strong defensive positions themselves. Although you will see photographs of Soviet horsemen charging with sabers drawn, actually that was quite rare. It didn't really happen very much. Most of the time, these guys are operating more like 18th century dragoons. You use the horses as transport, and then you fight as infantry. But starting in 1944, early 44, they came up with something called the cavalry mechanized groups. And these consisted of maybe 3,000 horsemen in 2 or 3 regiments, backed by a mechanized brigade, which would then have motorized infantry and a tank battalion and motorized artillery. So you would then get the best of all worlds. And the exploitation group for that southern thrust was commanded by General Issa Pliev, who is the epitome of the cavalry commander, short, wiry, bow-legged, big moustache, and looks every bit a horseman. Jonathan Ewer, 20th Panzer Division, starts this battle with about 100 Panzer IVs, which is still below strength. The other point, actually, that's very useful. One thing that's worth remembering throughout the last maybe third of 1943 and certainly the first 3 quarters of 1944 is that it is almost inevitable that every Panzer division at some point during that time will have an extended period when one of its 2 Panzer battalions is absent, because it's back in Germany retraining and rearming with Panther tanks. The Germans do not have the flexibility to be able to pull entire divisions out for re-equipping and reorganizing. They do it piecemeal. So that means these divisions are fighting, they're already at half strength in terms of their tanks, even before battle begins. But as we'll see, 20th Panzer's fighting strength diminishes very rapidly as this battle unfolds. So the cavalry mechanized group entered the penetration and immediately swung off to the northwest. 1st Guards Tank Corps continued the drive directly towards Bobruisk. 20th Panzer Division began to form up at dawn on the 25th and started its attack. The wheeled elements were then meant to go into action on its left or eastern flank, but they were still in the process of arriving. This was meant to be in support of 35th Infantry Division, but by midday, this division had pretty much ceased to exist, and the divisions on either flank were also disintegrating very rapidly. Yorton contacted Busch at Army Group Center and said, I need to pull back. I'm being outflanked on both of my flanks, and the troops left in the middle are going to be surrounded. And Busch says, no, the penetrations are too narrow. They can't move proper supplies through those. Hold your positions, limit the width of the breaches, and make counterattacks. Already by now, 20th Panzer Division is down to 40 tanks. So remember, it left 1 tank company up north. The rest are either breakdowns or lost in action. And I suspect it's probably about 50-50. Some will be stranded in swamps, etc. Others will have been knocked out by Soviet gunfire. Many of them will just be damaged. But if you're going backwards, recovering those wrecks, repairing those wrecks becomes that much harder.
Quick question about tactical air support, because when we're talking about Normandy, yes, and we will be again soon, and Total Eyes and Tractable and Cobra and things like that, of course, close air support is integral to that. And Steve Zaloga is kind of fairly dismissive of Soviet air support, saying it's, it never really gets beyond kind of mediocre. Are you kind of in line on that?
Yeah, very much so. A lot of it is doctrinal, for reasons that slightly, escape my understanding. When Sturmovik pilots attacked columns on the ground, so a column of vehicles or transport or whatever, or even a train, the doctrine was to attack it at right angles to its direction of travel, not to fly down the road, where you would machine gun the entire column. I suppose the theory was that if you were off to one side or the other, going along the road would mean you would miss with all of your shots, whereas if you were cutting across the road, you were always going to hit somewhere. I don't understand that. That tactic changed as the war went on, but at first it greatly limited the impact of ground support. The Sturmovik's performance became another bit of Soviet myth-making after the war. It probably was nowhere near as effective as the Soviet writers claimed it was. Certainly by the time it was deployed in the Korean War, it was, a flying coffin. It was useless. It had very, very little effect indeed. Yeah, I agree, Gregory. It is just a very, very ineffective way of attacking. But that was their doctrine. By summer 44, they're probably beginning to change this, not least because by now you have pilots who have some experience of just how stupid this is, and they're beginning to do their own thing. Also, the Soviet air power was used in a way that would seem really, really inflexible to Western thinkers. So much like we were talking about how plans were very much top down and were passed down the chain of command, etc., the same went with air power. You didn't have this Western approach of a cab rank of aircraft that could be called in for ground support or were ordered to roam over an area and shoot up pretty much anything they spotted. They will be given specific missions. Today, comrades, your job is to strafe this road to the east of Bobruisk or something like that. So there was no, they lacked the flexibility to go after targets of opportunity. So if they came across a supply column or a German column where they were expecting it, that's great. If they didn't, it doesn't work out. So the sentence at the end of this page is the one that I think really sums up Busch. And so Jordan is saying, I'm about to be surrounded here. I've got 20th Panzer Division, which is disappearing. 3 of my infantry divisions have been blown to the winds. I need something done now. And Busch's reply is, well, I can't approve your request this evening as I need to run this past Okaha. So I can't do it today. It's too late. It'll have to wait until the morning. Because let's face it, the Red Army is going to give them until the morning in order to think about what's happening. So next slide, please. Jordan makes an entry in the diary of Ninth Army, which again just sums up this guy's growing despair at what's happening. Having made a conscientious report, one has to accept the orders of one's superior, even when one is convinced of the opposite. What's worse is awareness that the completely inadequate orders from the army group are not the product of purposeful leadership striving to do its best, but merely an attempt to pass on orders that have long been overtaken by events. This is a man who is absolutely pissed off with what he's being told to do. But what can he do? His hands are tied. And this is where this instinctive obedience of the Wehrmacht High Command continues to cripple them. In such circumstances, would a British or US general have just said, this is rubbish, I'm just going to do what needs to be done? I don't know. And it'll be interesting to have that sort of conversation at some point with people who know a lot more about Western generals than I do. But let's move on. So 26th, this is now look at how rapidly the advance is now unfolding. And this is what we were talking about earlier, where I said, the German infantry divisions can put up a good fight, but when they start to be levered out of their positions, once they start taking losses, they go downhill very rapidly. And look what's happening here. You can see in the south, the 2 exploitation groups, the cavalry mechanized group heading off through Oktyabrski towards the left center, and 1st Guards Tank Corps has now reached Bobruisk in the north. To the right, that drive has now gathered pace with a tank corps striking directly towards Bobruisk. And by the end of the day, those pincers are terrifyingly close to the town. There's going to be an encirclement here. Even if you start pulling out now, 35th Corps and 20th Panzer Division are probably not going to get out of that pocket without taking very, very substantial losses. So next slide. Here's a summary. 12th Panzer Division has now arrived from the north, from Army Group North as reinforcements. But look at that. It has 13 Panzer IVs and 9 Panzer IIIs, barely 20 tanks. And this is Panzer Division because, you know, one of its battalions is away in Germany, and it hasn't had a quiet time in Army Group North. It's been in action. It'll have many more tanks in workshops scattered along its line of march, but that's all it has when it arrives. 20th Panzer Division is ordered to disengage, pull back towards Bobruisk. Meanwhile, everybody is moaning at Jordan about how badly he's running this battle. And look at the mess you've made of how 20th Panzer Division was used. Yet, if you cast your minds back to what we've been saying, he had absolutely no say in how it was being used. He was being told all the time, it's going to attack the northern pincer. No. Only part of it's going to attack the northern pincer. Actually, wait a minute, it's going to attack the southern pincer. And yet, he's the guy who carries the can. He gets summoned back to Minsk, and from there flies back to Bavaria with Busch, and he's dismissed and told, you're rubbish, you're out. His replacement will be Nikolaus von Foreman, but while Foreman is finishing his holiday in Berlin and heading out to the east, command is delegated to Helmuth Weidling, who is a corps commander in 9th Army and has now inherited command of the army. Weidling, some of you may be familiar with the name. He is the man who commands 56th Panzer Corps in Berlin right at the end of the war. But anyway, this guy has now inherited a very, very rapidly deteriorating situation. So next slide. This is Foreman, reasonably competent commander, certainly way better than Busch, probably similar sort of caliber to Jordan, very competent man, knows what he's doing. He was heavily involved in the fighting during the Cherkasy encirclement earlier in 44, and had shown considerable determination and skill when he was dealing with inflexible orders down there. And he's now going to have to do similar things. But for the moment, he's somewhere between Berlin and the Eastern Front, packing his bags, getting ready to go out there.
Somewhat of a poisoned chalice he's been given, isn't it? So, to be fair.
Well, can you imagine? Yeah, I mean, I think any German commander these days getting a new posting would have had that moment of utter terror, regardless of what job they were doing. Just as an aside, we're talking about Army Group Centre today, but of course, you know, you have Army Group North, you have Army Group South, which has now been divided into Army Group North Ukraine and Army Group South Ukraine. By the end of 1944, between the beginning and the end of 1944, nearly every single army in those army groups will be encircled at some point. It's an extraordinary fact. And yet, despite all of that, somehow the Wehrmacht emerges from that year still able to continue fighting, which is, you know, a measure of, in some respects, the resilience of the Wehrmacht and how it could keep on going. Anyway, let's move on. So 27th, and this is where the pincers close now. 35th Corps is left trapped in and around Bobruisk. The exploitation forces are now pushing off towards the northwest on the left there, pushing up that railway line and road line towards Osobovichi, which is where 12th Panzer Division is meant to be arriving as a relief column. But you have upwards of 50,000 men now trapped in and around Bobruisk. You have 20th Panzer Division, you have a lot of infantry with them, and of course you have all of those rear area units that are not allowed to withdraw. And Bobruisk is a fortress. It is to be held to the bitter end. You're not allowed to break out. So Ebenezer, how dare you suggest such a thing? It has to hold out until Hitler says it doesn't have to hold out. and this is going to cause problems in the days ahead. How long were the German units able to effectively counter before they run out of ammunition, Peter? Well, they're short of ammunition almost as soon as they start moving because they lack the transport to move it. But one of the very few advantages of retreating is that you're retreating towards your supply dumps. So in a way, the location of your supply dumps tends to dictate your line of retreat if the enemy will permit you. And so you're always going to be coming across scraps of ammunition. There are always units that are being broken up, disbanded, tanks being abandoned, etc. So yeah, there are various factors that allow them just about to keep on fighting. And of course, because they're retreating now, they're not fighting these set-piece defensive battles which just consume huge quantities of artillery ammunition, etc. They are just going backwards very, very steadily, Okay, next slide. So on the 27th, 20th Panzer Division leads the breakout attempt and claims it knocked out 20 tanks, but for 1st Guards Tank Corps, that is barely a pinprick. It just brushes the panzers aside and continues on its merry way. Weidling is given permission by Busch to take command of all the forces that are outside the encirclement, but he must continue to hold Bobruisk and the line to the east. So you have 35th Corps now in the encirclement and 56th Panzer Corps without any panzers outside the encirclement. But Busch is still insisting that all of those orders must prevail, the fortress must be held, that even the defensive lines around or outside Bobruisk can't be abandoned. You're not allowed to withdraw to the fortress because the Führer has not explicitly told Busch that he can do this. And Busch is so timid when it comes to dealing with Hitler that he's not the sort of person who's going to suggest doing anything as revolutionary as that. So next slide. Now we've moved on from that series of maps. This is now a slightly different map. Bobruisk is still towards the bottom right. And now you can see Minsk, the capital of Belarus, appearing, and you can also see the defensive lines that the 12th Panzer Division has set up. Remember, it was meant to motor on to Osipovichi, but it hasn't been able to because the Soviets got there first. And towards the bottom left there, you can see this is the cavalry mechanized group leading the way, pushing away to the left. So even if you try to defend this area, you're being outflanked, deeply outflanked. Where was Busch at this time? Army Group Center's headquarters at this point was in Minsk, so he's towards the top left-hand corner. But look, you can also see the other sectors now coming into play. So 4th Army to the north has pretty much disintegrated. You have the Red Army pushing down from just above the center of this map from Vitebsk, where 3rd Panzer Army has fallen apart. So even if Busch's dreams of holding Bobruisk had lasted, it was rather pointless because the whole position is being massively outflanked. And already the Germans are beginning to fear that there is a master plan here where the Soviets intend to carry out a pincer movement on Minsk, in which case it's not just what's left of 9th Army that's going to get caught up. 4th Army is also going to get wiped out, as are all of the troops that have arrived as reinforcements and are trying to establish a new defensive line.
Quick question for you, Prit. I mean, do you think any of the German commanders, either in the field or the headquarters, have any sense that there is any potential victory there, or are they just aware it is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic at this point? I mean, is there any real hope of any solution to this other than just prolonging the inevitable?
Oh my goodness. It's a very interesting question, and it also then goes to the heart of an even bigger question, which is, why do we fight?
When do you abandon the ideology? Yeah,
when you've got to a stage where you think the war is lost, we're just going to go backwards slowly. Well, Paul Hauser, who was an SS general, in his account of the Battle of Kharkiv in 1943, he wrote, he was criticized for abandoning Kharkiv and then retaking it when Hitler had ordered the SS to hold it at all costs. He wrote that, orders, of course, must be obeyed, because without that, everything breaks down and there isn't any proper chain of command. And that's the difference between the military and an armed mob. But he said, ultimately, the ultimate responsibility of any commander is towards his own men. And there comes a stage where acting in the best interests of your men may be in conflict with your orders from above. And you've got to be prepared to answer for that if that is the line you take. Interesting position for an SS officer to take, but I think it's a position that most Western commanders would probably recognize and understand. How widespread that was in the Wehrmacht, I don't really think it was. I think they were still very much hidebound. They were very much bound by this sense of responsibility, this sense of obedience. And from the Western point of view, this strange belief that because they had given an oath of loyalty personally to Hitler, that bound them forevermore, and they could not go against that. How much did they believe they could still win this? Well, Manstein writes in his memoirs that even at this stage, he believed it would have been possible to fight the Red Army to a standstill. If we, I don't like, what if history, because it didn't happen, and you usually end up with one side doing something really innovative and the other side blundering around, and that's really unfair because you don't know how the other side would have reacted. But let's just stop and think. If Army Group Center had had a more forceful commander who had somehow persuaded Hitler, let's say it was Model, and had sufficient trust from the Führer that he had been permitted to pull back to the Berezina line, and had sufficient reserves to be able to counter this attack, they would probably have stopped the Red Army somewhere between the Berezina and Minsk. They would have inflicted massive losses on the Red Army. What effect would this have had in the long term? It's worth remembering that when we get into 1945, it's really only the Guards armies and the Guards divisions and corps that are now being brought up to full strength. The Soviet Union is actually beginning to run out of men. So had the Germans fought a more flexible battle in the East, it is arguable, I'm not going to put it any stronger than that, it is arguable that the Red Army could have reached a stage where it was running out of resources and was no longer able to keep on battering the Germans into oblivion. And as I said in a previous show, the Red Army is not, it's not a saber, it's not a rapier. No. It's a bludgeon, it's a blunt instrument. It's become a better blunt instrument as the war has progressed, and its commanders have learned how to swing it with much more effect and how to use it. But it's not a rapier. And in the end, if your bludgeon starts to become smaller and smaller, it becomes a less effective bludgeon. So I think it is conceivable, possibly, that the Germans may have been able to grind down the Red Army, in which case the Western powers would then have been faced with the task of advancing all the way to Berlin, taking all of those casualties, etc. And let's face it, British and American and Canadian losses during the Battle of Normandy were sufficient to change mobilization plans, etc. in the West. So it's, everybody was feeling the pinch by the end of the war in terms of manpower. So if you have a change of tactics on the East that results in the Red Army suffering even more losses, it could have quite a profound effect. Who knows? It didn't happen. We will never know.
Thank you. Great response.
Okay. Gwilym, I'm skeptical too. In the end, we're asking the Germans to do something that they were just never going to do. And that's why I don't like, contrafactual history like this. So anyway, 28th of June, the 9th Army Diary sort of blandly records that we're no longer really an army, are we? We're just a bunch of guys running around in the countryside. Someone asked about partisans earlier. All of these units that are disintegrating, and these guys are trying to make their way back across this landscape, they're constantly having to fend off partisans. They're constantly having to deal with hit and run attacks, which just grinds them down still further. So Busch says, well, 56th Panzer Corps can break out, but it's got to leave a division behind in Bobruisk. And Hofmeister, who is now Corps commander with Weidling now in charge of 9th Army, decides he's going to ignore that and he's just going to break out with everybody. 12th Panzer Division has arrived, and Hitler sends new orders, which are pretty much the old orders, just dressed up again, saying everyone's going to stand where they are, not a yard of ground shall be given up. I'm confident the army group will do everything in its power to accomplish the task set it, and I expect my confidence to be justified. How dare you think otherwise? And Busch is dismissed, because, let's face it, he hasn't really covered himself in glory. Now, you can look at this two ways. You can say, yeah, Busch was massively over-promoted as an army group commander. He was probably over-promoted as an army commander, but what the heck. Certainly he was way out of his depth here. But on the other hand, what's he done wrong? He has obeyed all the orders that were handed down to him from above. So again, he's being blamed for somebody else's errors, or is he being sacked because you weren't insubordinate enough? You didn't show enough freedom of thought. Bizarre, really, isn't it? Anyway, Model, the great defensive genius, is to take over. So he arrives from at this point, he's commanding both Army Group North Ukraine and Army Group Center. And the theory, at least, is because Army Group North Ukraine has the bulk of the panzer divisions in anticipation of this great offensive that the Germans expected to land there, they're very happy to have these two fronts now on under one command, so those panzer divisions can be transferred rapidly, or at least that's the theory. Model arrives and he does the usual Model thing of sending very, very strong messages to the frontline troops. He's a whirlwind of energy rushing around, telling everybody that, I've got the Führer's ear, I'll be able to get permission to do stuff, but in the meantime, you guys have got to support me by fighting hard, etc., etc. Typical Model stuff. But he's going to fight. It's worth looking at the map and you think of how far Army Group Center had retreated by the time he came to command. By the time this offensive eventually runs out of steam, the Soviet forces are on the outskirts of Warsaw. So under Model, this great defensive genius, actually, Army Group Center goes back even faster than it did under Busch. But he is hailed by everybody as the man who managed to stabilize the situation. So let's move on to the next slide. So by now, the Germans have pulled out of Bobruisk, and the little breakout group heads off mainly north and ends up in that little town of Swisloch to the north and slightly to the north west of Bobruisk. 12th Panzer Division is pretty much on its own now, still blocking any Soviet advance on Minsk. Soviet forces are still gathering their strength around Slutsk, bringing up reinforcements, bringing up supplies, etc., gathering their strength. But look what's happening further north. 4th Army is about to get annihilated. And some of those of you who are students of history may well remember the crossing of the Berezina during Napoleon's retreat of 1812, and the bridge that was built across the ice, and the thousands of French troops who sat listlessly on the eastern bank as the Cossacks sabred them to death. Well, this is summer, this isn't winter, and there is no ice, and instead these guys are struggling across fields infested with mosquitoes rising up from the swamps and partisans coming out of the woodwork everywhere. Soviet aircraft are overhead doing greater or lesser amounts of damage depending on who you believe. But the main point is they're just being outflanked. They're being rounded up here, and they're in serious danger of being encircled. One column of escaping German forces is going to reach 12th Panzer Division, but the main body is still in Swisloch. So shall we move on to the next slide and have a brief summary of the 1st of July? So they reach Galinka and move on towards Osipovichi. A second column, like I said, managed to link up with 12th Panzer Division. But the main body is now at Svistloch. 12,000 casualties have been suffered since they left Bobruisk. Some are dead, some are stragglers who have been surrounded and taken away. The remaining 30,000 are now pretty much out of supplies. During that day, the Armoured Reconnaissance Battalion of 12th Panzer manages to link up and extract the bulk of these troops, but in all, 9th Army has left behind 24,000 men who have either died or have been taken prisoner. Several division commanders, one committed suicide, and I think 3 were captured, 2 of whom were then subsequently executed for war crimes. How many made it back to Germany after the war? Probably about a third. The death rate was very high, not only in the immediate weeks after, but also during the years that followed. Most of the survivors who were released were not released until 1955, when Adenauer visited Moscow. Some smaller groups were released, but by this stage, the Soviets needed manpower for reconstruction. They weren't going to let prisoners go. This is the level of human losses that the Soviet Union had suffered. So that is the story of the death of 9th Army. Eventually, Foreman would arrive. He would take command of just one corps, basically, and as reinforcements trickle into the area, they first of all form a Gruppe Foreman, and then eventually they become 9th Army again, and 9th Army will then play a major part in the fighting along the Vistula and then along the Oder as part of Army Group Vistula before during the battles for the Seelow Heights. So next slide. Those of you who want to know more, March next year, this will be out. We are in the design stage of producing this book, so imminently I will get a list of typos to fix and bits where I have given the wrong army or the wrong name or whatever, and the painstaking work of doing this, fixing this now begins. And then what will happen is that as soon as I actually get a copy of it, I will open it at random and I'll see a typo immediately. So all of you,
what happens. It is how it works. But we've got to wait till next March, Prit. I mean,
yeah.
But even before now, just sorry to interrupt you, is that this German army that has been smashed by this, it's still there nearly a year later. It's still, its ability to kind of rise, albeit a smaller phoenix each time, and a smaller, weaker, less equipped phoenix, but remarkably stubborn.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many of the original headquarters personnel are still there. So to an extent, it's the name that's being resurrected rather than specific, the actual body of the army. That's been pretty much smashed to bits. But yes, you're right. The Germans just keep on reinventing the army, and it's interesting, isn't it, how Hitler would reconstitute divisions, but he'd also had this great fetish for inventing new divisions. And yet the armies just kept on getting recycled. The army numbers just kept on getting reused and reused and reused. And 9th Army would get chewed to bits during the Oder offensive, and would then fight very hard on the Seelow Heights before retreating into the Halbe pocket, from where ultimately you would escape. Those of you who are interested, Weidling, when he was in command of 56th Panzer Corps on the Seelow Heights in 1945, lost contact with 9th Army headquarters, where General Busch was now commander. Nobody knew where he was. He, after 36 hours of being out of contact, attempted to fight his way through to the rest of 9th Army, where he discovered that both Hitler and Busch had sentenced him to death for attempting to retreat to the west without permission. So he then traveled to the Führer bunker to say, why am I being executed when I haven't done anything wrong? And the reaction of Hitler was, oh, thank goodness, right, the whole of 56th Panzer Corps can now retreat into Berlin, which is how you then end up with this extraordinary mixture of troops defending Berlin at the bitter end. Anyway, there you go.
Well, let's finish a few questions, Prit, if you don't mind. If we can, this one leads the next one. So, Tim, I love these Prit Butas. What shows he's got a voice like single malt and a vast amount of information I've never heard before. So that's a comment, but it tells us to David Oakey, what is Prit drinking tonight?
Well, tonight it's been jasmine tea. Probably not drinking anything stronger tonight, but tomorrow there will be a very nice Sicilian white with a fish curry. So that'll be
you came from left field there. I wasn't imagining we were going to the vineyard of Sicily.
Well, there you go. You know,
I love the fact, your ability to surprise me. So let's go back into a couple of questions. So yes. Ian did ask right at the beginning about the Soviet attitude to minefields.
Yes.
So
the Germans made huge use of mines, really massive use of minefields, because, you know, it is, if you like, a labor-saving or a manpower-sparing means of defending areas. But minefields are not particularly useful unless you can cover them with machine guns and artillery. By this stage, the Soviets were pretty good at sending sappers forward who would try to pick routes through the mines in the day before the battle began. Didn't always succeed. All of these stories of using penal battalions to clear minefields, it did happen, and it happened around Vitebsk. It probably was not as common as some accounts would suggest. It certainly did happen. But it was certainly not a widespread use, and it would not have been necessarily the first choice of how to clear a minefield. The preferred route was to create a sufficient route for an advance to take place, and then, you know, leave it for rear area units to clear afterwards. There were countless occasions where, you know, survivors of attacking units would describe how they went, you know, they followed the little red flags and found that the mines hadn't been cleared or had been cleared inadequately, and they took heavy losses. So, yeah, it was a hit and miss business. They didn't have Western style minesweepers, as per the last, flail tanks or whatever. They used artillery quite a lot as a mine clearance technique. So, you know, they would lay down thick barrages, which they would creep forward over a minefield in the hope that would just blast everything out of the ground. Which would sometimes work, sometimes wouldn't. But the preferred option always was to send forward bodies of combat engineers over the day or so before the battle, and particularly the night or so before the battle, in order to lift mines and clear lanes for the advance. And this is another interesting thing, that by this stage, the Soviets have introduced a new innovation in their artillery barrages, still as heavy and as murderous as ever. But now what they're doing is, when they lay their barrage and the barrage creeps forward, the guns have been coordinated to leave diagonal lanes empty through the barrage. And the intention is the attacking infantry will then be moving up physically within the barrage. How often the troops actually had the nerve to do that, I don't know, or we will probably never know, because, you know, so much was distorted after the war by official historiography. Then by the time that veterans were able to write their own memoirs, memories were fading. You know, we were well into the 80s and into the 90s, and it was no longer possible to say exactly what was happening. Interesting, David, I didn't know that they had a T-34 minesweeper, but certainly I hadn't come across them in the memoirs that I have read, or the field commanders' memoirs that I've read. So I suspect they were present in...
Steve Zaloga mentioned it yesterday, that there were a few specialist vehicles, because they had kind of seen what the Allies were doing, and because they had some Valentines, things like that, they kind of must have got some access. So but not in the kind of numbers that would have made a fundamental difference, is what Steve said. But well, so a couple more questions, and we will enter. Willie Robertson, right at the beginning, said, did the Soviets purposely commence Bagration on the anniversary of Barbarossa?
Very good question. I think probably they did. Unlike so many Soviet operations, it was not subject to delays due to weather or logistics or whatever.
Right.
So it kicked off pretty much when planned, and it would be one heck of a coincidence if it wasn't intended. I'm not sure, I'll have to look into that. I'm not sure I've come across an account that explicitly says,
Right.
yeah, we did this to match the date. But yes, given that the timetable didn't shift, it must have been deliberate.
Yeah, thank you. And then a couple of people asking about the sources. So Mad Cat said, is it hard to find Russian sources? And then somewhere else, someone said about, yeah, wonderful stuff. 100 points to sidebar comments at the end. Can Prit talk about sources and what he suspects may still be slumbering in the inaccessible Russian archives?
Oh my goodness, that's a horrible question. So sources. Two great websites for people to look at if they want sources. There is a site called militera.lib.ru. So that's militera.lib.ru and iremember.ru. Now, if you go to these websites with a browser that does auto-translate, these days the auto-translate is pretty good and it will translate it pretty well for you. So Militera is quite a large library of digitized books. Some of them are in rather difficult formats. Others will just take you to web pages of text. And this will give you the memoirs that were written by Soviet commanders in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. It'll give you some of the official histories. So you'll get, if you like, the orthodox historical view of that. iremember.ru is a website that was created by a guy called Artem Drabkin during, I think, the 90s. And he and a few of his friends went around interviewing the last generation of Soviet survivors of the Red Army before they all died out. So there you have interview notes on, from ordinary soldiers, from pilots, from engineers, from gunners, etc. Some of them are fascinating, some less so, but you can search that index for specific battles, for specific arms, etc. One of my starting points of any, so for example, writing about the Berlin operation at the moment, I just went through every single Militera interview with a survivor of the Berlin operation and just made a note of the ones that had something that was of use to me in them. They often give you a very different slant from the official Soviet historiography. So those are two very good sources. Other sources, my goodness, to be able to get into the Soviet archives or the Russian archives, I fear it's probably not going to happen again in my lifetime. They started closing these some years ago.
Yeah.
Even when they were open, they were not fully accessible to people from the West. There were still areas which were bizarrely classified, and I couldn't really see any logical reason why. Part of me suspects it's because they'd lost them, and it was just a convenient way of not admitting that those particular orders had just disappeared somewhere or had been destroyed by somebody deliberately, artificially, accidentally, who knows, but we'll probably never know now. I still have some contacts in Russian academia who are able to get me occasional bits and pieces in exchange for bits from Western sources that they can't get at. You will understand that I don't want to get these people into trouble by naming them, so that's how it is. Karatakis, I believe the Russian pronunciation would be Bagration rather than Bagration, which tends to be the Western way. It's worth remembering, though, that Bagration or Bagration was a commander during the Napoleonic Wars, where French was almost universally spoken by the upper classes of the of the Russian Empire, and they would have known him as Monsieur le Général Bagration.
And then the last one was it was much earlier in the show, but at what point, at this point, how much influence do the political commissars have?
Well, their role has changed. At this stage, they're not really in the business of marching along with a bunch of NKVD behind the lines, shooting people who are running away. NKVD is doing this, undoubtedly, but not under the direct control of the commissars. The commissars now are involved much more in preparation of the troops. So alongside all of their combat training, etc., they're going to be giving them stuff on they're going to be giving them indoctrination. They're going to be many of the Soviet units at this point were running revenge books. So a division would have a book in which soldiers could write accounts of atrocities committed by Germans in their village or against their families, and these would then be read out by commissars at these meetings. So their job is more about motivation and keeping guys committed to the fight. And we can belittle this, and we can say that this, from a Western point of view, this seems very alien. It doesn't really fit into our way of thinking. But it's worth noting that prior to almost every operation, they would have these lectures where they would talk to men right down to battalion and company level. And as a result of these talks, many of those young soldiers would apply for membership of the Communist Party. And we're not just talking one or two, we're talking hundreds. I'm not aware of anything similar happening with lots of people wanting to join the Nazi Party as individuals as a result of the indoctrination they were getting. And certainly in the West, we had nothing like that compares. So it's the whole business of political indoctrination, of the role of commissars, is so wrapped up in, from a Western point of view, the very, very strange world of the Soviet Union, that we struggle to make sense of it because we don't really have those terms of reference that even today's Russians find instinctively much easier to understand.
It's exactly the same with the Pacific War historians and the Japanese or Chinese systems. Just everything is so different to the Western approach, just culturally, historically, and you have to kind of go in there and not only look at a different language, but look at an entirely different way of how everything is done. And it's taken, 8 decades for people to begin to kind of understand how this stuff works. We had that with Giles Milton earlier, but we will bring things around. But there's an interesting point for about a potential panel show we could do. Perfidious Paul is saying, would Bagration have gone differently if the Germans had seen the Eastern European front as being the most vital instead of shipping units around the less crucial fronts? Well, that's a big if, isn't it? I mean, we talked about with Steve, we could bring someone on about the Western front, the Eastern front. There's still Yugoslavia and things going on. My point about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, whether there is something they could have done in the spring of 44 differently to prolong things you don't like counterfactual, but there's definitely a discussion to be had.
Very much so. Very much so. I think that we touched on this earlier, didn't we? Had the Germans fought more effectively on the east, had they moved more divisions to the east in order to hold back the Red Army, that would have been accepting explicitly that they were going to lose the war on other fronts.
Yeah,
this slightly bankrupt strategy of we will throw the Western Allies back into the sea while we hold the Soviets at arm's length. By then, the new U-boats will be ready. We'll restart and win the Battle of the Atlantic, and then the tide will turn. It's a pretty useless strategy, but you are holding such a bad set of cards if you're the Germans by now that really that's about the only strategy that has.
You just can't imagine Hitler letting any of his things go. I mean, if he becomes at the pitch, because the assassination attempt that in July came up in the sidebar, and maybe suddenly someone else takes over, who that might have been, and they say, okay, can we afford to lose this front but keep this front? But that. All the time, indeed. Mr. AH is there. He's not going to let anything go, is he?
And for those who are interested in the July plot, there's a whole chapter on it in this book. So, and it's bearing on what was unfolding on both fronts.
Oh, no, you've just whet my appetite. I've got to wait another 10 months for it. Ridiculous. But anyway, we'll leave things there. Prit, as always, it's been brilliant. I will look forward to seeing it. We Have Ways. And sharing a drink there finally. We did bump into the 2 years ago, but not for very long. You were busy and I was busy. But this time...
I'll be there on the Friday, and I'll probably stay on the Friday evening. But I'll be heading home on the Saturday.
Well, we'll see each other on a Friday. So, folks, again, thank you so much for your fantastic questions. We've got another show with you tomorrow. Hugh Davies coming on to talk about the Soviet planning, kind of where it started historically. And then Dr. Phil Blood is on Friday to bringing Bagration down to a very small point of view of just his research into some of the very small unit tactics. So that's our initial look at this operation, but I'm sure we'll return to it again. Click, like, and subscribe. Buy my guest's books. The NIST book we've been talking about is not available. There's a huge list in the description below of other books you can buy if you haven't already to tide you over these next 10 months, folks. So just go and buy a few and make Prit's bank manager happy. So cheers, everybody. See you all again tomorrow. Thanks, Prit. Bye.